Mesechtes Peah, Perek Gimel, Mishnah Aleph. We learned in the previous Perek that each field requires its own Peah. This was what was discussed in the previous Perek, which gave many examples what was or what wasn't considered one field. The Mishnah now continues with the same topic. Malbenais hatvur shebein hazesim. If you have squares of grain that were planted between different olive trees, a malben is usually a brick, a square mold used for shaping bricks. This term also is used to refer to a square patch of grain whose shape is similar to that of a brick mold. So the Baal Habayis planted grain in the space between the olive trees in his grove, so the grain grew in separate patches between the trees. So Beis Shammai Oimrim Peah mikol echad ve'echad. Beis Shammai say that the Baal Habayis has to leave Peah from each and every one of the squares because each one is considered a separate field. Beis Hillel Oimrim me'echad al kol. But Beis Hillel say he may leave Peah from one square for all of them because they're all considered to be part of a single field, even though there's a lot of space between all of them. So it's interesting because Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel agree on the basic halachas that are happening over here. Both agree, Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel agree that when the Baal Habayis purposely separates his grain into certain patches that he could have easily combine them together, such as where the trees are widely spaced, each patch is considered a separate field. And both agree that where it's not practical for him to make the patches continuous because the trees are closely spaced, then the separation does not indicate that he wants the patches to be separate and they are considered to be part of one field. And the Rav goes on to explain this more ba'arichas. And Beis Shammai agree that if the edges of the rows were connected, that means that the edge of each square was connected at some point to the square next to it, meaning that there was no space in between. That he may give Peah from one square for all of them, since all the squares are connected. Even Beis Shammai will agree that they're considered to be part of a single field. Mishnah Beis. If someone harvests his field in patches, which is called menamer, because the patchy spots in the field make it look like a nomer, which is a leopard, which is very spotty. And the pasuk in Yirmiyah says v'nomer charvarvu roisav, that it has a lot of spots. And he first cuts the ripened stalks as they ripen. That's how he collects them, and he cuts them, and he leaves the moist stalks standing. That's kolachim lachim, the moist stalks. Rabbi Kiva says when he comes to harvest the moist stalks that ripen later, he gives a separate peah for each and every one of the patches because each one is considered a separate field. But the Chacham is saying he may leave peah for one patch for all of them because they're still considered to be part of a single field. The Chachamim considered the second round of harvesting to be a continuation of the first round, even if it was later. So therefore, the entire field is but a single, unseparated field that was harvested by skipping from place to place. But the question is that the Tosfos Yontif asks is that why, in the case of our Mishnah, should he be mechuyev and pay altogether? Since the Mishnah in Perek Aleph, Mishnah Dalet says that you're only chayiv and pay if it's l'kitasa ka'achas. And over here, it's not l'kitasa ka'achas because as it ripens, he's cutting it. And then he's cutting the one that ripens later, even if it's a few days later. So from the Bir Hagro and the Yerushalmi, it would seem that the Tvuos in our Mishnah is considered that it's l'kitasa ka'achas, since it refers to when the dry stalks harvested first would not have rotted if left unharvested until the moist ones became ripe. So his splitting of the harvest is just a convenient time of when he wants it to be considered, but it's not. It is l'kitasa ka'achas because he technically could harvest it and cut it all at once. He just chooses not to. But Chachamim say me'echad ala kol, he may leave peah for one patch for all of them because they're still considered to be part of a single field. Umaydim Chacham l'Rabbi Kiva b'zerei hasheves aychardal b'shloisha mekaymis runais peah mikol echad ve'echad. And the Chacham agree with Rabbi Kiva that if one planted sheves, which is dill, or chardal, which is mustard seed, in 2 or 3 places in the field, that he gives a separate peah from each and every one of those places. Why? Because since these types of fruits, these crops, are generally planted in patches rather than in one continuous stretch of a field, each patch is considered to be a separate field, even if there's little space between them. This this does not seem to have anything to do with the machlekes between Rabbi Akiva and the Chachamim just mentioned. It's unclear why the Mishnah says here the Chacham agreed to Rabbi Akiva. The Rambam explains that this case of the Mishnah is this case that avoids this difficulty. The vegetables are generally not subject to peah because it's not because it's not a davar hamiskayim. Dill and mustard, sheves and chardal are vegetables that are grown for their edible seeds, which you can't keep in storage. Therefore, they're obligated in peah. Okay, Mishnah Gimel. This Mishnah continues with other cases of one who harvests his crop in different stages. If one pulled out moist onions from his crop of onions to sell in the market and keeps the dry ones in the ground to be harvested for storage, he gives pay for these by themselves and for these by themselves, meaning the ones that he pulls out now, and he does one payah, and the one that he pulls out later, he is mechuyev another payah for those as well. V'chein ba'afunin, v'chein b'kerem. The same halacha applies to afunin are chickpeas, and b'kerem is the same halacha applies to a vineyard. If a person harvests his crop of chickpeas or grapes in two stages, the first ones that he wants to sell in the market, and then the ones later he wants to store them when they ripen fully, they're considered like two separate minim, and each one is mechuyev in its own payah because he wants to do separate things for them. He's not just harvesting it. In the previous Mishnayos, we were talking about just where he wanted to harvest it. There are two more cases that the Mishnah is going to discuss about the onions. If one first thins out his onion crop to make room for the remaining onions to grow, because onions that are planted together have no room to grow, so the Baal Bayis has to pull out every other onion so that the remaining ones will get bigger, and this is called meidel, which is from the sherish of dala, which means to pull out or to lift. Probably a lashon of deli, which means a bucket which you lower and then you pull out. And then he later harvests the rest of them. He gives payah from what's left for what he left growing. But if he pulls out the moist onions and later the dry ones for one purpose, that's what it means. He pulls out all of them me'inyan echad, the Rav says. Either he wants to store all of them or he wants to sell all of them. And the Rambam learns that it's from one place, that when a person sells onions in the marketplace, he pulls them all out, he plucks them all out from the same place in the field. So if he plucks out the moist onions and then later the dry ones for the same purpose, so then he gives payah from what was left in the ground to dry for all the entire crop. Since they were all harvested for the same purpose, all part of one harvest, even though it was done in two stages. Therefore, one payah can be given at the end for the entire crop. Mishnah Dalet. Mother onions are obligated in payah. What are mother onions? So, mother onions are onions that are left in the ground to produce seeds, and because they're left in the ground for so long, they're barely edible, so people eat them only in emergencies. Nevertheless, the Mishnah holds that when they're eventually harvested, payah must be given from them. So the question is, that we learned before, that things that are eaten only b'shas adchak is not something that's mechuyev in payah. So that applies only when that min is eaten only in an emergency. However, onions are regular food, and it's only these specific type of onions that have become less edible, and therefore they're obligated in payah just like onions. The min of onions, this type of onions, is just like any other type of onions. Onions are mechuyev in payah. So this is a type of onion that we don't eat as often as regular onions, but it's still going to be mechuyev in payah. Rabbi Yossi Paiter. Rabbi Yossi says it's not mechuyev in payah because these onions are taka only eaten in an emergency. If you have squares of onions that were planted between patches of vegetables, so the vegetable patches are separating between one patch of onions and the next, Rabbi Yossi says he gives a separate payah from each and every square, each and every patch. But the Chacham say he may give payah from one square for all of them. Since the onions last in storage where vegetables don't, the Chachamim consider the vegetable areas to be insignificant parts of the larger onion field and therefore do not separate it. Mishnah Hey, the earlier Mishnayos discussed how a single field is separated by physical separations, such as a mechitza, or patches, or malbenois. The Mishnah now discusses how a field might halachically be separated if different people own different parts. So if two brothers divided a field that they got Yerusha, they give two separate payas, each one from his own half of the field. If they went back together and joined together again, they give one pair for the whole field. When they first yarshed the field from their father, they each owned half of the field. When they divided the field, each became the only owner of that half. Now they made a shutzos together and they became co-owners of the same field. Since both now own the entire field together, it remains one field and one pay is enough. The Mishnah refers to where they join together before the harvest, because if it would be after, then it would still be considered pa'as sadcha, your field, and each person would be mechuyev and pay separately. So Zok the Mishnah, if two brothers divided a field that they got by Yerusha, they have to give two separate payas. If they went back and joined together again, they have to give one pay for the whole field. And the Mishnah teaches a similar halacha in the case of a tree. If two people bought a type of tree that's mechuyev and payah, they give one pair for the whole tree. But if this one bought the north side of the tree and the other one bought the south side of the tree, this one gives pair for himself and the other one gives pair for himself. The Mishnah teaches that not only does a field become separated by having different owners of different parts, as the Mishnah started off with, but even a single tree becomes separated in a way that each half of the tree requires its own payah. And I wanted to speak something out a little bit interesting. The Klal will say that if the tree is growing all as one big tree, so then what's the difference? How could you split it? But that's the chiddush over here. A field you can divide, but a tree may be less easy to divide. Aval Pikin was saying that it's still, this halacha still exists. There's zenais and pe'el atzmai, zenais and pe'el atzmai. The Mishnah teaches another case of separate ownership resulting in separate pays being given. If someone sells individual tree sprouts, kilchei ilan, which means they're small trees that one generally buys in order to uproot them and transplant them elsewhere, small little trees. And if someone sells these individual trees that are full of fruit in his field, without selling the land in between them, so the buyer gives a separate payoff for each and every one of these klachim, each one of these small trees. Rabbi Yehuda says, when is this so? When the owner of the field did not leave over any of the klachim for himself, or sold them all to the buyer. But if the owner of the field left over these tree sprouts for himself, then he gives one payah at the end for the whole field of these klachim, even for the ones that he sold. So the question is why? If the owner sold them before the harvest, then the buyer himself will have to leave his own payah. Rabbi Yehuda is talking about where the owner began the harvest and then sold the klachim to the buyer. As soon as the owner begins the harvest, the payah obligation for the entire field took hold in the end of the field. When he then sold the klachim to the buyer, he was selling the klachim whose chiyuv of payah already exists in the klachim at the end of the field, so there's no need for the buyer to leave anything as payah because the meicher is already mechuyev. Mishnah Vav. The Mishnah gives various opinions as to how large a field must be in order for it to be obligated in payah, which is interesting because really the Mishnah should have mentioned this way back in the beginning of the Masechta when the Mishnah was discussing what the chiyuv of payah is altogether. Rabbi Lezer says that the karka, the land, has to be an area large enough for planting at least a quarter of a kav of seeds is mechuyev in payah. If it's smaller than that, it's not mechuyev in payah. Rabbi Yeshua says that even a land that produced only 2 sa of zera is mechuyev in payah. Reb Tarfon says that even if the land, the karka, is only 6 by 6 tefachim, he's obligated in payah. Because Reb Tarfon learns that the definition of soda for payah is learned out from Klayim, but from a different halacha in Klayim. Because the Mishnah in Klayim, Perek Gimel, says that the Isser of Klayim is the shear of the field is shisha al shisha tvachim, and shisha al shisha tvachim can accommodate 5 different types of zera, different types of seeds, and there's no problem with Klayim. So, being that in Hilchos Klayim for this purpose, that you could plant 5 different minim in there, it's considered a field. So, L'gabe Peh, it's also going to be considered a field. That's the sheet of Reb Tarfon. Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira, I make they look to Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira says even land that produces only enough to gather in one fistful of produce and then repeat it, it's obligated to pay. Meaning 2 handfuls of pears, which is very, very small. The usual way, what do we mean when he says Kidei Liktar V'Lishnais? Because the Rav says Derech HaKoitzer Oiches Molekapim and Hakam of a Koitzer, that the usual way of gathering grain was to grab a fistful of stalks in one hand and to cut them with the sickle in the other hand. Kidechsiv Shaloi Molekapoi Koitzer. And if you have and if there's enough room in the field for 2 of these fistfuls, grabbing these 2 fistfuls of pears, that's ready mechuyev and pear. Halacha kidvaro, and halacha is like Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira. Rabbi Kiva Omer karka kol shu chayeves bepeir. Rabbi Kiva says the land of any shear is mechuyev and pear. Rabbi Kiva holds that the Torah doesn't specify the shear, so that can mean even the smallest amount of land that grows produce is mechuyev and pear. So the question is, how can the smallest amount of land be obligated and pay if it's large enough for only 1 stalk? Then the 1 stalk is cut to begin the harvest. So there's nothing left to leave as payah. So the Yerushalmi explains that if the single stalk has several ears of grain growing at the top, then the harvest can begin with the cutting of one of the ears, and the other ear, or the other ears on this 1 stalk, can be left as payah, which is a gavaldige chiddush, but that's how little a person has to have of payah in order to give to another person. Uba bikurim. And bikurim as well. Even the smallest amount of land, even the karka kol shehu, is mechuyev and bikurim. Lift of a prusbul, and to write a prusbul, even if he has a karka kol shehu. Right? So prusbul, we know that the Torah forbids a lender to collect his loans after Shemitah. Because of this Isser, people didn't want to lend money. So Hillel was a masakin of prusbul, like the Mishnah says in the 10th parak of Shvius. A prusbul is effective only if the borrower owns land, because then it's if the Bezin already holds the land mortgaged to the loan before Shemitah. And even if it's a tiny, tiny piece of land, it's still considered enough to write a prusbul. And to acquire along with it which would be metaltalin, whether you want to buy it bekesef or shtar or b'chazaka, whether you're buying it with money or with a shtar, with a document, or with a chazaka. So these are 3 different types of kinyanim, like the Mishnah teaches in Kedushin. However, if one is buying metaltalin together with the karka, then the kinyan on the karka is good enough for being kaina the metaltalin, which is called kinyan agav. And our Mishnah is teaching that in order to make a kinyan agav, it doesn't matter what the shear of the karka is. The karka could be very big, the karka could be very, very small. Even if the karka kol shehu, it's enough to be kaina ima nechasim she'en lahem achrayos. Mishnah Zayin. Having mentioned at the end of the previous Mishnah that any amount of land is enough for the halachas of peh according to Bekiva, or bikurim and prusbul and being kaina with kinyan agav, so now the Mishnah continues to list other halachas about the shear of karka kol shehu. If someone writes over his property to others while he's seriously ill at the end of his life, but he didn't specify that he was doing it because he felt that his death was near, so shear karka kol shehu matanosim matana. If he left over for himself any amount of land, his gift of the property to others is a valid gift, even if he recovers. But had this gift been motivated by fear that his death was near, he would not have saved some property for himself. Therefore, we assume that it was a straightforward gift, and it stands even if he recovers. So shir karka kol shehu matanos matana. Ober, what happens? Lo shir karka kol shehu ein matanos matana. If he didn't leave anything over for himself, then it's not considered a valid gift if he gets better, because his leaving nothing for himself, he's not leaving anything for himself, so he doesn't care about his properties anymore. So we're assuming that his kavanah was that he was going to die soon, and since he recovered, it was a mistake, because if he gets better, it was a mistake that he gave it away. So the ein matanos matana, the matana doesn't go through. Another halacha about karka: if someone's very ill and he writes over that his property should be given to his son, and he writes to his wife also any amount of land, and she says nothing, Ibda Ksubasa, she forfeits her right to collect her ksuba from the properties assigned to the sons. Why is that? Because a woman's ksuba entitles her to certain payments from the husband should he die first, which then she could collect from his land, on which she has a shibud for the amount of the ksuba. In the case of our Mishnah, the husband gave away all his land to his sons and his wife, and the piece that he assigned for her is worth less than the amount of the ksuba. So Rabbi Yossi Omer and Kibbul Oleha Aval Pish Lekosav Lo Ibdu Ksubas. Rabbi Yossi says that if she accepts upon herself that on her own to take a portion of the estate together with the sons, so even if the husband did not write over anything to her, she thereby forfeits a ksuba payment as well. In Rabbi Yossi's case, the husband never actually included her in his instructions together with the sons. She just agreed to the idea of being included together with them. So Rabbi Yossi understands that even in this case, she's assumed to have waived her rights to collect her ksuba payment from the land given to her sons. Okay, and the Mishnah Ches is the last case of the parak over here, which discusses karka kolshu. If somebody writes over all his property to his eved, which is an eved Kanani, Yatza ben Chayrin, the slave goes free. Because all my property includes the slave himself, because he's part of the property of the master, of the bailam, of the odin. So this shtar, in which the master gave all the property to his slave, is also a shtar shechrer, a bill of emancipation, which is going to set the slave free. So shir karka kol shul leyatza ben chayr. But if the master, in the wording of the document, leaves over for himself any amount of land, the slave does not go free. Reb Shimon argues and says that in all the cases, the master leaving out some of the land, the slave still goes free. Acha yomar, until he specifies harei kol nechosai nesunin l'shpleni avdi chutz me'ech meriba shebehen. Except where the master instructs that all my property shall be given to so and so my slave, pliny, except for 1/10,000th of it. In that case, Reb Shimon agrees that the slave does not go free, since the unspecified chutz me'ech meriba shebehen might be included to the slave himself. So even if the slave's market value is clearly more than 1/10,000th of the property, it might be that the master does not consider him worth more than 1/10,000th.